this is the final part of the day. I think we had a very long and productive day, and I'm certain that there are many questions which could be discussed now from the participants or the audience. I would just like to say something just to trigger the discussion, and then I leave it to you. Something which we started with in the morning, and it came up several times through the day in different ways. The question of the critical and criticality. And I'm saying that because many people seem to question the necessity of being critical or even using the term critical. And I can understand why. The last 15 years everything was critical, so people are reluctant to use the term. But the way it somehow appeared and discussed today within the context of writing, the practice of writing, the practice of architecture, I think begins to suggest, perhaps, and hopefully, a new way of thinking or defining what we mean by critical. And I was talking with Nasreen during the break, and then we agreed that actually the question should be posed in the way that what constitutes, it's not about being against or for criticality, but I think the question should become what may constitute criticality today, and what extent these new forms of practice or new forms of writing and new kind of modes of production of architecture knowledge can include or incorporate the possibility of new also forms of criticality. Just I leave it here. I know it's a very vast question. As I said, more to trigger the first comments, and then we'll move on to other questions.
I'm happy to start off by just throwing something in. Perhaps it will be quite contentious, I don't know. I would say that I've never signed up to the post-critical side of the debate. And for me, I've always tried to define the term critical by using the definition from critical theory. So within that, you would have both self-reflection of the type that Eve was engaging with in her talk, but also political critique. And I think that might be something where people kind of don't share views, really, that people would have very different ideas about whether they did or didn't want to engage in political critique or in a practice that had a kind of social emancipation as part of its program. But for me, particularly given the moment that we're at with the rise and rise, shall we say, of the neoliberal project, it becomes increasingly important to voice a political critique, certainly for my own practice. So I would say, for me, those are the sort of agendas at play, and they're not optional. They're a necessity for my work. But I think what becomes really interesting would be the modes of operation or how they become effective. And I think that word affect would be really key in terms of how do you touch people, how do you influence people, how is it possible for people to perhaps start reflecting on their practice differently and possibly change ways of thinking. So I think the mode of operation for me is really key, and that's what's very exciting to see, this sort of whole kind of flowering of experimentation that's going on.
And let's bear in mind, just briefly,
Mario, you have to speak into this thing, apparently, because otherwise they can't record us.
critical and
Into it.
critical
Into it.
and
Yeah, I know.
Don't be afraid. Don't. It doesn't
I
bite.
can use it.
You are the expert on media.
Critical and criticality have specific meanings in the architectural domain. They are related to specific persons, whom I shall not mention, one in particular. Just one
You've
anecdote.
already mentioned them.
Just one anecdote. Many years ago, when I was not familiar with the American university system of architectural education, I was surprised by the fact that some of my first American students used the term criticality in a way which did not make any sense to me. So one day I asked one of the students, almost in secret, and asked, listen, what does that mean? And they said, oh, criticality for us just means X. And they said the name of a person. Yes, I'm not going to say which person. But so there is this meaning, which is related to one person, to one period, and to a few schools, etc. Now, this strict definition of criticality is historically determined. It is related to persons, period, and places. Whereas I think that what you had in mind when you were introducing the problem of criticality this morning was a much wider and more comprehensive definition. We are talking about communication. And communications have this magic power of being born out of and of creating communities. This is what it is all about, I think. It is not about Mr. X or Mr. A or Mr. B. It is about creating a discourse which, through a communality of topics and interests, creates a community of participants in a discussion which, in our case, has to do with the built environment. This is, I think, what is at stake.
Yes, I agree.
I suppose, to some degree, I kind of said something of it in, some of the readings that that I gave. That I suppose, if sticking to the ideas from that, I certainly would say that it is certainly that idea of exposing, and I noticed that you used that word of exposition, presuppositions, right? That's upon which we base something. So when I put that question of how do we build, or how do we construct, or how do we architecture without presuppositions, right? And so I hadn't really thought that before. I just, because I was here and I realised I wasn't one person who had very little to do with architecture. But then when I saw Nazrine's project and she was talking about the ground, and that is the one thing we often take, to have a critical relationship with the ground is often very difficult because we think we can't, right? And it's sort of why there was, I think, a lot of argument about certain discourse that got labelled post, whether they were post-critical, post-political. It was this idea we no longer had a ground, right? It was almost like a bad thing to have a ground. I think it's the idea that the ground is something we actually presume is always under our feet. So the idea that suddenly the ground, in terms of architecture, and the type of the whole sort of metaphoric repertoire equally that the ground brings, with ideas of community, commonality, to be exposed in what you were talking about, I thought was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So I think that would, at the moment, would be my take. But I think one has to be very careful about ideas of becoming dogmatic about what constitutes the critical. And I can remember within my education, right, which was through Marxism and feminism, there was a lot of kind of you're in my group and you're not, because I'm critical and you're not. You know what I mean? It became very dogmatic, right, and boiled down to basically a series of gestures, right? So I think that's my take on
it. This idea of exposing is quite, it was very much at the heart of things for me. This is where we learned about that here. Exposing one's ideas in order to be able to, at some places where we were within a context, to be able to defend the position, as opposed to being able to protect the position, became in itself a way of being critical. And I think that what is very interesting is what you just said, that, yes, in the past 15 years everything has been critical, therefore all of a sudden we don't have any place for criticality anymore. There's another thing, which is, it was very important at the time that specific person brought out the question of criticality where he brought it out, because of the fact that in architecture there was there was not a discrete, but a very violent separation between what one would call architecture and what one would call the legitimization of architecture, which is building. So in effect, this person brought in that separation into a very discrete separation through the mode of criticality, meaning that you would only be talking about architecture if it is critical, otherwise it is building. And therefore, this separation became even greater, especially because in America, we know that it was a situation. And what I do sort of like about when you bring it to the question of collective is that it's a very European idea. I don't want to say that America is bad, Europe is good, but it is the fact that as soon as you bring the idea of criticality into the collective, it takes on a very different mode, and therefore its place of operation, its context becomes very different than when it is in America. So that's where critical theory in Europe is a very different thing than critical theory in America. Now, I mean, let's for one moment I don't want to go into details, maybe we'll go later on. We don't have any wine here, it's only water, so I mean, I don't think that that's going to happen. Actually, the AA is getting to be worse than Princeton, you know, it's sort of, if you were not 18 years old, you couldn't have a drink, but anyway, let's close the parentheses. Or Cornell, for that matter, it was an undergraduate school, you know, you never bring drinks in front of everybody. But the fact, I think, is that what I absolutely wanted to create within the practice of architecture was a moment whereby we can be sure that what we do as a practice of architecture needs another level of discussion and another level of expose, in order for it to become alive. So I think that one of the things then that I was hoping for was that I wasn't only talking to the other architects, but I was talking to other architects by saying, you have to do it as well, or we all have to do it, in order to take the practice of architecture elsewhere. And this practice of architecture going elsewhere would need to have both very architectural operations, such as sort of revealing a ground, but then putting it somewhere else, therefore displacing it. Once you displace the idea of the ground, which was done in modernism, then through that you can perhaps allow to talk about what is happening to the ground today. So I think that this sort of displacement, but also superimposition, allows, there are architectural operations that one deals with. If you're dealing with it in a plastic way, they actually are design operations. However, when one begins to think about them and bring them into the thought construct and possibility, then they become theoretical and therefore a critical, maybe, moment of thinking within another form of production, which is architecture. So that's where I think criticality still has a very, very sort of potent moment that it can have, and I really don't believe that it's finished, because we've talked about it for the past 15 years. You know, I don't think that's not what you're saying, but I'm just saying that there is this relationship of that everything is critical, therefore there is no criticality anymore. Yeah.
But, sorry. Maybe it's an age thing or a generation thing. But
thank you very much.
It's a good start. Sorry, it's like originally I'm from Germany. So
why do I do this to all young men?
Anyway. It's like from my like looking back at the last 10 years, I don't have the feeling we went through critical times. I mean, maybe I have a completely different understanding of it, but I have this thing that I have the idea that, or got the impression that until at least 2008, it was all about, well, let's go, the wall came down, and the global discussion, and it's all about networking, and you see the chances, and actually, no, you don't want to stop and hesitate and take time. No, you want to embrace the opportunity and go out and get stuff.
You were not born in the 70s, so you don't remember what.
No, but that's
It's a generational factor.
Moving on.
no, but it's like because I felt an agreement that actually there has been a period of criticality and criticism, and I don't see that even implemented within the discourse.
Probably because you came of age
So it is
during
about
the time
generation.
during the time of post-criticality. So you have never seen what, meaning your age was a period when criticality had already been shelved. The age of the reaction against criticality, particularly in America, took place in the course of the 90s.
Yeah.
And the climax of anti-criticality was the second half of the 90s. And for some bizarre reason, it is also related to the rise of digitality, even though I think this is coincidental and not causal. I have a question for, no.
I mean, I don't really have anything to add to the critical. I think, except to just observe that theory is in an inverse relation to the business cycle. I mean, theory is in an inverse relation to the business cycle. So theory will come back, criticality will come back now as building stops. And so, you know, and that explains what happens in the 90s, I think. But I wanted to take up the point about that you said about using the word affect. And maybe I could use it to slightly relocate. I mean, this afternoon, I apologize, I was teaching this morning. But obviously writing was the term, but in fact, most people were talking about prose, I mean, in effect, and kind of strategies of prose and places where you can kind of publish prose and modes of prose organization. And so I'd like to sort of maybe bend the stick back a bit by just talking about writing perhaps in an architectural context, in a very, very literal sense. I mean, I feel I came to this view because I had to go and speak after the death of Jacques Derrida, where architects in New York held an event for him. I thought they were rather kind of ungracious. I mean, they praised him as being important, but somehow, as Bob said, they felt it was like we've moved on. But he was discussed simply as a philosopher might discuss Derrida as a set of arguments and propositions. One thing I'm quite sure is that's not how architectural and art students experienced reading him. And when I say him, I mean a lot of other things as well. And I would say there that the student responded to the writing in a very literal way, not terribly organized around the question of an argument, not necessarily being able to summarize it like a good little philosopher's essay, but nonetheless being shaken by the writing. And it's that aspect which kind of interests me, because I think it covers a lot of art students and architecture students' response to writing, but which in a way doesn't summarize itself in things like essays. It actually summarizes itself in their artwork or their architectural work. And I think to sort of understand that, I mean, this is not about discussion. It's about the more solitary thing of reading and writing. And it's about the sheer materiality. It's to invite the fact that that affect, I think, is linked very much to the overlapping character of what we might call a field of inscription and of drawing. So it's looked at that material level, where I think what the student often responds to is suddenly a phrase. It's certainly torn out of a context, as a kind of philosopher examiner would say. It doesn't matter. It had this often very powerful affect. And so it's often those words, I mean, we could imagine, a world made up of affective inscriptions, which in some sense takes up the imagination of those people, and it's how it's linked to drawing. So I'm not concerned here with publication, I'm not concerned with intellectual argument, I'm not concerned with the organization of prose, but just the very literal and material, and to my mind deeply affective relation of the inscription.
I think that's a fascinating point. Sorry, did you want to respond?
No, just towards another, please, and then we move on.
Well, I think it's a great point, because I think something that's sort of been under the surface a little bit, but we've maybe talked about in breaks, but not in this setting. And maybe some of the students here will want to comment on this as well. And it's something that you raised at the beginning of pedagogy. And I think that something that I've been really trying to do for a long time now within the architecture school setting is bring this, the work of affect, which I think is a very powerful motivator in the studio, to bring it into the writing realm. So that rather than people writing about architecture, I still think there's a huge realm for intellectual argumentation, but it's also very interesting to see what happens when writing is driven by affect, and when that kind of breaks down the traditions of the academic essay and produces a different kind of, I guess you would call it a performativity in writing. And then I think it opens up a really productive space for kind of conversation between studio and seminar, if you like, or between design proposition and the conventional essay.
I think it was Nazreen who mentioned Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt became the kind of guru, as it were, of Kenneth Frampton, who was a friend of mine. And I've just read about Kenneth Frampton. His father was a carpenter builder, and Kenneth started his own life by deciding he wanted to be a farmer. And he worked 2 years as a farm laborer, beginning with labor. Then he switched to work, and he was following, without knowing it, Hannah Arendt's story. Work, in the end, became work with Monica Pidgeon, editing architectural design, and working with my partner, Douglas Stephen, designing a building and putting it up. Work. Then he got onto Hannah Arendt, and he decided that what one needed was an idea of surplus, going beyond what was necessary, something extra. And that led him to the idea of surplus energy. He wrote his book, and it's called Modern Architecture, A Critical History. Isn't that the answer? Isn't Kenneth Frampton the model for what you want? No.
You answered it yourself, Bob. You've answered it before in your own articles as well. Of course it's no, but I'll stop there, I think.
Could I respond to, it's a pity Mark wasn't present when I spoke before, because I said, if I can recollect myself, that it seemed to me that maybe I spoke of the idea of a telos, but a telos that the aim, the goal was something that actually was in itself experienced, that was not mediated by theory. It didn't occur to me as I said that actually one, in the end, you also encounter and experience text itself, as well as building, and that's what I wanted to add.
Now, maybe I just want to say something about Arendt, because I'm not a specialist of Hannah Arendt, but as a student it interested me, and it was a quote or a citation in a text by Colin Row describing the when the IBA exhibition, or the Berlin IBA exhibition, first started. And it's a very interesting sort of superimposition of two ideas that Colin Row, in his sort of very, very difficult writings sometimes, and specifically in this case, he would do, whereby he juxtaposes two ideas. One is exactly what students would do with Deleuze or with Derrida in the 90s, which is taking the text as a sort of for a tracing system, that you would trace the text in order for it to become form. And I mean, not going into the question of form here, but the text would become a material, but not a material that would be constructed, but a material that would be traced. Yeah? So you could, if you read Hannah Arendt's text on the Respublica, and the capacity of the collective, and the capacity of this pristine table, which then is talking about labor, and then take the text of Korb with his table, and the, the positioning of everything on the table, which is only talking about juxtaposition of forms. What is very interesting is that if an architect takes the text of Hannah Arendt, the drawing that one produces is a very different thing that one takes the idea of Le Corbusier's table. However, they are, Colin Row at least, is saying that they are talking about the same thing, which is the juxtapositioning of systems, which create, you know, a sort of an either an urban system or an architectural system, but they are political systems in themselves. So that's where, in the 90s, when you would read that text, you had a very different, and that's where I come back to what Mark was saying, we had a very different reading of that text into and its application in architectural thinking than if you would read it, or rather in the 70s, because I was reading it in the early 80s when it actually came out, or in the mid 90s when we were using texts as, or students were using texts as tracing forms. And therefore the text had two different functions at different times. And this is where it comes back to this generation, you know, difference. And what text has what text is today as a mechanism in architecture then becomes very important. How do you actually teach writing in a studio of architecture interests me. Are you going to be describing the work? Are you going to be using writing in order to be able to clarify the way that you design? So what kind of a mechanism do you bring into writing in order for it to become what type of a material then interests me, both as a teacher but also as a practicing architect? And what I was trying to do with the Dazibaus was that after what we had done, I wasn't trying to find out what the reasons for these projects were, was to see how I could make and bring into them a mechanism by which I could allow that to become this other system of reading. So I think that's where, you know, I would like to sort of throw in maybe another idea.
In a sense, you have already yourself provided one possible answer to the same question by showing your Dazibaus project, where you posit and you argue that the act of design can be a critique of design, which is not a bland statement. I mean, it's something which 25 years ago would not have passed muster. 25 years ago, the critique of design should be whatever you like, but certainly not a design act. You should abstain from design in order to critique it. It was also, to some extent, related to the post or conceptualist environment of the time. Now this is over, and you have shown that it is possible to be critical of design through an act of design. But then, significantly, and you have emphasized that, you show representational drawings of buildings which do not yet exist.
Not all of them.
Or in some cases, or when it is designed, it is prior to their being built, using notational images you did point out that you abstain from perspectival images. So you represent buildings existing or non-existing, or even more crucially, buildings still to exist using deliberately a restricted visual language, limited to technical notations, plans, elevation, and sections, and you refuse the seduction of realistic or mimetic images. So you use a critique of the visual language in order that your act of design may be a critique of design. There is a certain logic in that, right?
Plus a perversity, yeah, sure. Yeah. There's an absolute logic in that. And that's why then I think the writing comes into the, I mean, in order to refuse to show those images, then writing, and I don't know who it was, I think it was Eva that was talking about this, or I can't remember who it was, but anyway, it was a very important moment for me to note this thing, is that then when you refuse the image, which she did, then when you refuse the image, you're actually allowing for another drawing or another image to be inscripted through the text. Therefore, by refusing the image of architecture and only allowing
The representation of image.
yeah, and only allowing those that can read the image into the drawings, then you allow, then all of a sudden the public and the architect are equal. Because the public is reading through the text the capacity of the image, and the architect is reading
The technical notation.
the technical notation. Therefore, you actually force the public and the architect to be in an equal situation. Because always, in an exhibition of architecture, the architect is higher up because he can read more into the issues there. And the public all of a sudden becomes sort of, I'm not an architect. The public always says that to you. I'm not an architect. I'm not a specialist. Can you answer me this question? So this was a deliberate act of actually putting the public, architect, therefore the known, the savant of architecture, and the public onto the same table.
But
Which
also I would like
requires some use of words.
Absolutely.
but I would like to say that the act of design in this case, and I think that's why that I more read it as a device, as a mechanism, it's kind of broader than just design as a collection of drawings. So I think the textual and the visual and the images, they're all part of the project. So I would say more project rather than act of design. Because there was this combination, this visuality, which was the outcome, the product of these different elements composed together, come together. I would like just to give the opportunity to the audience to ask questions.
Yeah, it's kind of a question, kind of a comment. I think I've got a microphone already here. Thanks.
Yes, you need to.
I need two microphones.
Even better. Stereophonic.
Feedback if I do that. This one's working? Good. You were talking, Nasreen was talking about, if criticism describes architecture, and Jane, you were talking about taking the use of affect in the studio into writing and things, and Hans was mentioning Patrick's book, the Autopoiesis of Architecture. And I thought Patrick's book's quite interesting in this context. I know he's not here to defend himself. He was here this morning, but I think he left. But it strikes me that that book could be, it claims to be a description of parametricism. Well, it claims to be the first. Obviously it's only the first half, and the second half is still to come. That really will be describing and putting forward parametricism a bit more, but. There is a description of parametricism in that, or that's what it claims to be. And I'd say that perhaps what the book does more is to use. I mean, I think there's a trompe-l'oeil effect where it's really using our acceptance of having become accustomed to 3D renders of buildings that don't exist, and using our suspension of disbelief with those images that really. Through reading the book, we're kind of duped into the fact that this is actually a description of parametricism, and in actual fact, it doesn't describe parametricism. It describes it describes parametricism, but not built projects. So it doesn't go into, it doesn't talk about what the practice is actually building, but it talks about a kind of more of a fantasy of parametricism. I don't know if that's taking the conversation in a different direction, but it's something that Hans, I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Well, it's very difficult for me to answer because I'm one of those who haven't read it yet. I managed to find Parasitism mentioned on page 103, not being included in the index. So I mean,
for me, it was.
I don't know. For me, I think it is a fascinating endeavor, because, and a very ambitious endeavor, because he actually does something that for most architects wasn't really favorable in the past years. Thus, to actually write a comprehensive book, where I do think when you read it, or when you read pages, you can somehow see Patrick Schumacher in that book. It's his book. It's his view. And I think this is something that I appreciate. I mean, without wanting to judge it, or without being able to judge what's in it. But I think the attempt to be comprehensive and thorough in a way, to publish your own work in full intensity and in a thorough way, not as a blog. I think a blog does in a way a similar thing, but it's ruptured. It's like moments, and it's a collaging, whereas he really goes deep. I think he went to great length.
Perhaps moving from Patrick's view to the question of the collective.
But I think in terms of, I want to stress that, I think in terms of criticism, it's really an important book, whether someone likes to see it as such or not. I think that he forced the importance, I'd say, but he does succeed in that.
It is not our subject today.
You know.
But did you not raise the issue? The remark, he said he wasn't writing about parametricism, but a fantasy of parametricism.
Perhaps can we move back to our?
No, but
Please.
the point is, what I want to say is that not true to some extent of all writing that accompanies either building or the presentations of building? So to some extent, whatever is said has some element of fantasy. Somebody does a drawing or does a building, then presents it with some kind of verbal accompaniment, some kind of context-setting, description, presentation, and you present it as something. It is something, but it's also presented as something more. And this supplement is bound to contain some element of fantasy every time.
I was just, in answer to that, I think the reason why I was thinking about it was Hans's mention of what pliant criticism would be off the back of Greg Lynn's pliant architecture, and the fact that in Patrick's book he uses radical constructivism for his argument, but uses a different, which doesn't seem to be unified with his field theory on the other side. So the form and the structure don't seem to work together. That's why I thought it was. That's why I was using the word fantasy, I think.
Would you like to say something on the pliant criticism?
Patrick Schumacher, the words and therefore the writing of Zaha Hadid, that's to say, aren't they involved in two different people?
Well, actually, the moment which is very pleasurable in the book, because there aren't a lot of jokes or kind of,
Are we here to discuss Patrick?
it is actually, well, no, but it bears on the question of inscription and pleasure. It's the moment when he refers to Zaha Hadid. I mean, as if she were a kind of Spanish retail outlet. And, I mean, in a way, that exposes just very, very literally what some of the literal issues
writing and its overlap with drawing.
Can I just add something in here? Because I think Mark brought in Derrida, I brought him in very briefly this morning, and I think he is important here in the sense of writing. And I hadn't, I guess, quite picked up on critical as being so important, not knowing how you were framing the masters and so on. But just thinking about one of the things that Derrida really tried to do quite early on in his work, which is deal with the field of contamination between writing and criticism, which was very specific to literature and philosophy. And if you think about what writing means in the field of literature, then it almost has the role of design in architecture because it's writing and criticism. When you sort of move it into architecture, something else happens because you're dealing with design as the primary form of creativity and then criticism. And I think that whether or not it's a generational thing, I would certainly say that in 2004 we did a conference called Critical Architecture, which was a riposte to the American debate, but it was also an attempt to try and reframe the debate in a European context and look at other ways of thinking through this kind of binary. But at that point, and that's not long ago, it's 6 years ago, there was still a very strong feeling that you could either be a designer or a critic. And there was still this kind of worry that if you crossed the two, that somehow that was a problem of contamination. Whereas I think we've moved to a much more positive and productive phase now, where it's possible to say, as you did, that designers can be critics, and that design is a form of critique, which is what we tried to suggest in the book, but equally that criticism could be a form of design. And I thought the work that Giovanna showed was just so exciting in terms of the role of curation and the editorial work here. And I can't remember who said it, but someone said, maybe the reason that we have such a proliferation of exciting work at the moment is because of the number of platforms for production. And so I just think it would be important to kind of acknowledge the work of curatorship here, because in a way the context of the work you showed was very much in the exhibition format, which I think gives architecture a very different potential. So I just wanted to sort of put that in the mix.
And by the way, it was an interesting, an interesting analogy between, well, it is in the spirit of the time probably, when you organized the rules for the submission of the 15 texts. What you set out as what you call the dogma, or the brief, sorry to go back to the forbidden topic, it's the algorithm.
Yeah.
This is a parametrical approach to scripting, except this is not scripting, this is writing or scribing, but it is in the spirit of the time. But we think that we should write down, we would have said a recipe or a formula. We would call it today an algorithm or a metascript, but this is the organizational principle of all flexible, rule-based generative systems, something which we have so much assimilated in the domain of design, but we are now, not surprisingly, and with a certain logic, extending it to even writing literary composition. It makes perfect sense, it keeps together.
Yeah, it's true. We gave this kind of like framework, and I actually calling really like dogma.
But it is a parametric approach to composition, to literary composition.
Where everyone then finded a way of like cheating.
Sure, but that's the principle of parametricism.
Like for example, we asked that every 1,000 words there will be a date, and then people will use. Actually, because also there was no idea of using the images, and somehow it goes back to this idea of making images with words and with writing, so kind of like picturing a scene without using a real image. People will find a way of referring to specific period or time with the special events.
Writing down 4 digits.
Yeah.
Actually, to pick up on what Jane was saying, I was thinking that we've been talking a lot, or we've heard you talk a lot about writing and architecture, writing on architecture, writing within architecture, but we haven't heard you talk much about writing as architecture. And what you were saying makes me think that, I mean, nowadays, and it's been the case for a while, lots of architecture critics are architects, or former architects, or trained as architects. That's my case, that's the case of a number of you. And I I was wondering if those of you who want to answer that question would try to say a few words about how their training as architects influences or structures or does something to the fact, or to which point are they aware of that training having an impact, an influence, positive or negative, on the way that they write, that they work. Of course, the analogy, I mean, it's quite a provocative, I think, question, writing as architecture. I mean, for a long time, the discourse has been talking about the opposite, architecture as language. And the metaphor of a work of literature as an architecture is not new either. I mean, we've all heard of Proust Recherche being called a cathedral for all sorts of reasons. I mean, so in that train of thought, those of you who are architects, but also those of you who are not and who write on architecture, how does architecture with a big A, or as a discipline, or as something which implies a number of operations in design, influence the way you structure your articles, your writings, your subjects? I know it's a vast question, but perhaps we could try to launch it.
Perhaps I'll answer, because my title was Writing as Architecture, because exactly I wanted to put that as a question, to reverse the order, not architecture as writing, but the other way around. And I think that, as I tried a bit to explain in the morning, that for me, writing, I mean, being an architect, right? Writing is not only about, it's about the inscription, as Mark said, and also that in itself establishes a certain visuality, as I said, and also a certain speciality, right? So in one way, for me, writing is not just the text, the words, one word next to the other, or a way to explain or describe, but writing becomes a visual, and in this sense also a critical practice in itself. So it's more like writing as design, kind of, as I was trying also to discuss through the text, the document of Alberti, that's kind of defining the boundary, and at the same time describing but also declaring, kind of describing, and also make sure that it can be communicated, what you describe. So that's why it's, for me, it's more of a visual practice, in the sense that, as it defines and communicates, makes legible. And that's where the collective comes in, because in one way that introduces a space of communication, and therefore a possible space for debate.
And talking about spaces of communication, it is probably not useless to remind us all, but the amount, simple quantitative amount of information which is available to all of us and to the general public has surged in the last over 15 years in a way which is extraordinary in history, and it is only parallel to the rise of print in the Renaissance.
Yes.
Now, as we all know, sifting through this information is a problem, but let's look at the good side of things. We have never had so much information on all things architectural available as we have today.
Yes.
This is a
Maybe
game
which
changer.
also makes
The quantitative change is so dramatic, but it is a real game changer.
But maybe in this,
Pardon?
Why is that a good thing?
Why is it a good thing? Well, generally speaking, too much information cannot do much harm. Not enough information can be a problem. No one ever died for having access to too much information. I'm a bit optimistic here.
but maybe in this too much information, then the kind of like positioning yourself with the critical writing becomes even more
to
No,
define.
but the
and
other side
somehow
of the coin is,
Yeah.
of course, that this quantitative surge in the amount of information available is only parallel to the diminishing relevance of each individual piece of
Yes.
information. So we have so much more information because the relevance of each piece of information is decreasing at the same speed. This is the game, and this is the problem, in a sense. But, please.
I just want to interject one thing, and it may be a little bit off because I'm not a writer by profession, but it's I have noticed, at least in the past 15 years in architectural education, that students are having more and more difficulty to design. And when I say that, I don't mean designing systems, and I don't mean making something which is a part of something, but it is very difficult for them to synthesize things. And I think that what is very interesting is to see that, and this comes back to what Mark was saying, why is that so good? And I agree with you that having a lot of information at one level is great, because then what happens is what is exactly happening right now in the Arab world. On the other hand, having too much information also becomes the problem of Starbucks, which means that you can't choose your coffee anymore. So, I mean, it's
Could be embarrassment of
sort of
choice.
embarrassment of choice. So you don't know what to choose anymore. So what happens is that, I mean, I'm only observing this. I'm not sort of concluding on anything. I'm just saying that I think there is a problem of not having yet, within a sort of a pedagogical, not pedagogical, but in teaching, I don't think that we have come to positioning ourselves in terms of how do you make choice. Yeah. And I think that one of the biggest problems that we have right now in architectural education, and maybe in other parts of education, is that we don't know how to allow the sort of the multiple choice to exist, however, allow that multiple choice to come to some kind of a position.
Well, you know, there is a French proverb which says, trop de choix tue le choix. Too much choice kills the choice. But this is a problem of the information age.
But that's why also the question of...
Could I just ask the question in a sense?
Can I, just to follow up, yeah, but I think that's the question of positioning, which is very important. How you position, how you define these boundaries. It's not one boundary, probably it's multiple boundaries.
Yeah.
But perhaps, Mark, and then
It's
Oliver.
just to link the question of
We don't
a lot
have
of
too much time.
information with the question of criticality. I mean, it would seem to me a fairly standard historical observation that in the 19th century, critical thought was enormously weakened by the cult and triumph of what would be thought of as the fact. In some sense now, there is an exponential rise. So everyone has been championing critical thought, but as it were, the reduction of all elements to a quantitative matrix of information may well be the final undoing of critical thought.
Well, let's not merge information with argument.
Yes.
Information is a quantitative matter. Arguments are still dominated by the old principles of logic, which have not changed very much. You must find your arguments, put them in good order, etc. So the wealth of information is one thing.
Yeah.
It may be a problem or an opportunity. Building arguments, it's
another.
always the same old game. And in fact, having too much information or not enough information may be issues. But then building an argument from the beginning of times has always been the roots of, not of information, but of logic. Logic is a different matter.
Can I give the word to
Computers are
Oliver?
pretty good at
Sorry.
playing chess, but they're not much good at playing poker.
I think what?
We have to leave the lecture hall in 10 minutes, so please, Oliver, if there are any final questions.
But in that case, it's a bit late in the day to throw in something else. But I was just,
Yes,
for
please
the whole
don't-
discussion, I was thinking that there's one fundamental problem in architectural writing or writing architects or whichever way you want to see it, which maybe doesn't lie necessarily with the identity of the author, but really who is the target audience of the writing. I think it's actually symptomatic that for the second week now in a row, at every lecture, at some point, Patrick Schumacher's book gets mentioned, which apparently not a single person has read, but everybody seems to discuss. I think what happened in the mid-90s, what Nasreen mentioned, is very right. I mean, a lot of people who were not native English speakers were reading terrible translations of French philosophy and then regurgitated them with a Spanish accent. And I think what basically happened after that, what basically happened after that is that we ended up with kind of culture of architects writing that no one was interested in reading anymore. And that still goes on to a large degree today. And I found it fascinating what Giovanna showed which is a move towards actually fiction and a kind of literary form of architectural writing that at least aims towards being popular. And not just popular within a very limited field of architectural theoreticians, but a wider audience of architects, if not the public itself. So the question is really, what is the ambition of writing in architecture? If it is, as a discipline for the architect himself to design, to draw, that's one thing. The real problem lies somewhere else, in my opinion, which is how to communicate with the outside world. And that's where we fail miserably in many ways. And that's maybe where this kind of abundance of available choices leads to more competition and therefore a kind of focusing upon formats that are more successful.
Thank you. How many questions we still have from one, two? Okay, let's give priority to students.
Hello. I was wondering if I could bring back the idea of the deception of the image and maybe relate it to this idea of misusing photographs within the writing. And I'm not really sure the right way of how to use a photograph, but in my case, oftentimes I'm reading something with photographs which doesn't really do anything but describe the text. And so there are times when I completely disregard the writing. And I recall when I was a bit younger, I'd buy the New York Times and I wouldn't even read. I would just look at the photographs. But in the case of using, what I'm trying to say, in the case of using photographs, and I think about Giovanna mentioned Sebald and literature and the photograph being used to describe and kind of act as something in itself. And the photograph and the writing kind of both shake you together. And also, I think of Corbusier and Towards a New Architecture, and he uses kind of the airplane. But I'm just asking, maybe Giovanna can answer this, but the loss of significance in writing with the use of photographs and that question.
So I don't know, I think what I was trying to convey is that the work I'm doing is actually to try to always keep together the visual and the writing, and then maybe you will have to find the right way of writing to sustain the images, or we'll have to choose the right images to sustain. Like there is this kind of like dialogue between the two things, and somehow I think that you could have a fascinating writing that brings you to look at the images in a certain way, or the reverse, and through the images you are actually reading the text. So for me, I found that that's something that, and especially I think is something that could be done in in exhibition, in a book, where there is this, you could really, with the design, you could establish the hierarchy. Hierarchy is also about these things. But the last project we did was also these fascinating things of like saying there is no image. And so the writing has to actually give you this and bring you also in a 18th century in South Carolina, and even the reader had to imagine how that is without having a real image of that.
That's what writing used to do most of the
time. Yeah, but what I'm saying is, I know, and it's like for me what's interesting to push also, and I have to say that it's not easy to find a publisher in this moment who actually wants to commit to a book where there is no images, and it's like, but I will not sell it, and that is, they will say, go to a publisher who only is like more novel or literature publisher, because in the field of architecture, it's not.
I know the problem well.
Yeah, no. But I think it's more, I think it's up to us, to you, as kind of like forcing and bringing a different direction in this on the table.
There was I think you want to ask, yes? And you and Max, and I think we have to close.
Do you think that criticality is also about a certain kind of impartiality, and that the writing of architectural manifestos is quite problematic in that sense, that it may not be necessarily critical writing.
No, I would say the opposite in a way, which is that for me, criticality is absolutely about trying to articulate positionality. But a manifesto would do that possibly without the kind of degree of self-reflection that I think we've lost Eve, have we? I mean, just that she was talking about. But I would say that it's absolutely about trying to articulate the position you have in relation to the architecture.
It's also related to what you said about situated criticism. And Max?
My question is about, it has to do with this inverse proportion of the number of facts or arguments or knowledge and their importance, as it was suggested, right? I mean, that you have lots of information, but that it's countered with the fact that now every information is less important. And when it comes to the image, knowledge was brought up. Do you think images are knowledge?
To whom is the question?
To anybody who can answer it.
Is an image a form of knowledge? I'm happy to pass on that.
Mario?
Is the image a form of knowledge?
Yes.
Sure it is, but every format or every form of knowledge is medium specific. So there are ways whereby image can record and transmit information which are specific to images. Words work well for certain things. Pictures work better for other things. If you have to explain in a book how to make a bicycle to someone who has never seen a bicycle, you cannot show it without a picture. Technical books in antiquity and in the Middle Ages were not illustrated, which is the reason why they did not have bicycles. If someone had invented a bicycle in the Middle Ages and they could not put a picture in a technical book to explain how to make a bicycle, perhaps a bicycle was invented in the Middle Ages, but without reproducible pictures, no one could learn how to. There are cases where pictures are pretty useful.
The problem today, sometimes the other way around, which is to say that if I go to an exhibition to see a new project and they're planning a new building, I'll expect to see drawings, models, but undoubtedly I'll also expect to see words and they will explain the project. And the explanation may seem ostensibly, or it may be purely practical, but some of it, in its style and its content, will make critical presuppositions and assumptions, and it will have intellectual and cultural premises which may be stated or may be not. What I also know, however, is that once the building gets built, they don't put up a sign by the side of the building saying these are its premises, this is how to read the building, and so on and so on. The building, in the end, is the building without any words. The only exception I don't know to this offhand is Daniel Libeskind's War Museum in Manchester, which gives you an instruction as you go in. Now, this is a condition about architecture that most people would observe as its primary condition. It's on the side of the producers that all the words seem to happen. But once the building is there are no words.
Yes, but with most buildings we know, think of how many buildings you think you know. 98% of them, you only saw them in pictures. That applies to all of us. So there are 2% of buildings which are actually touched, but all the rest we know through mediation. And when mediation comes into play, something can be mediated and some cannot.
But I'm asking, you gave the interesting example of the bicycle manual. You could imagine a bicycle manual that had the pictures, but without the manual. And I wonder if sometimes that's the condition that the building is getting done at present.
What IKEA has,
IKEA.
No words but diagrams, but it also has the actual stuff that you put together. So it doesn't need words for that, it just needs 1, 2, 3. But I was thinking that in terms of buildings in use, the people who go in and out of those buildings illustrate to you right away in a kind of language, what happens in the building and what you're meant to do. So you can see when people are going to the loo, and you can follow them there and get to the loo yourself, better than if you were in words.
On that note.
Because
On that note,
it
on
really
that
becomes
note,
a model
yes.
of itself.
We can conclude the discussion on criticality. So thank you very much. I think we have to leave the lecture hall. No, we have to leave the lecture hall.
Unless you want to see 365 images, which is coming up by Peter Cook.
Yes, in an hour. So that's we need to go. Yes, one for each day of the year.
As we just said.
As we just said. So thank you. I would like to thank the speakers once more. And also I would like to thank you for being here the whole day. Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.